Okay, I thought I'd give you a little idea. In my class there was a we had a class about culture, and we talked about the aspects of culture, and then we talked particularly about the experience of culture shock, which happens when somebody has to start to get used for moving from one culture to another. And one of the students talked about his experience of moving from a rural southern community to New York City, the rural American southern community. But it was a community which I'm not sure many of you actually are aware that this is can happen today, but it was a place where there was no running water. People went to the outhouse. There was electricity was scarce, heat and well, air conditioning was non-existent, and certainly it was difficult to get from place to place. They did have to use cars to move in order to get anywhere to shop for anything, but there wasn't even a lot of money there. So, and he talked about how difficult it was for moving from that community to New York City. You can imagine how difficult it must have been for that as a young child. But to look at that a little deeper, one has to think about what is culture, uh, and the goal of studying sociology would be not only to look at your experience, but to be able to dissect it and analyze and understand it in its component parts. So, in order to do that, you have to think of what is culture as most basic level. And when we talk about culture, we define culture as the ways that a people in the society have learned to deal with the particulars of that culture. We know there are universals in the culture. There are universals meaning that there are things that every culture needs to deal with. Every culture has to work with, and that is the ideas of having to feed the people in the society, having to make shelter for the people in society, how they're going to propagate and have children in the society, how they're going to come together and have a interactions between people in the society, how they're going to enjoy things, how they're going to find pleasure individually and as groups. These are all things that every single society has. And those are universals. The question is how they do that, the particulars of how they do that as a cultural particulars. So in one place you might be living in tents in order to deal with the problem of how you're going to have shelter. Another place you might be in log cabins. In another culture it might be in high rises. In another culture it might be et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing with the food. You need to have nutrition. You need to have some sort of protein and carbohydrates and et cetera, and it sometimes cultures will deal with it very differently. So we have different foods and different ways of cooking and different ways of eating in the culture, and how to get together and how to enjoy yourself, etc. And those are the particulars of the culture. You've got the cultural universals, and then the particulars. In other words, like for sort of like there is a map that has to be in, for instance, you have a lock and a key. Every lock and a key has the lock and has a key. But the particulars are the particular ways of the way of how you're actually going to open up the door. You need to have a particular ways of doing it. So the question would then would be that even though you have all these ways of dealing with one another, all these particulars, they're defined in each culture according to their norms of folkways and mores, etc., taboos, where we said that the folkways, and with these norms, the folkways are those norms that having to do with not so important things, mundane aspects of society, where you want to talk about things that if you were to, and when we talk again about deviance, we'll talk again about that, but when you break the folkways, it's not such a big deal, although you might be looked at somewhat weird, and as if it's a more, then if you break those mores, it's a much more of a big deal. You might have certain serious negative sanctions, like being thrown out of that particular part of the society, etc., etc. Now, what happens is that since these mores, folkways and mores, all the norms of society are connected to the particulars of the cultural particulars, when you move from one culture to another, that's when you actually wind up finding, hey, if I'm going to get a negative sanction, if I'm going to get punished in some way for doing something wrong, then I'm going to feel uncomfortable. I'm going to feel it's difficult. And that's where you want to talk about how it is different when you move from one culture to the other. It is those breakings and changings and learning of the new norms which make the cultural particulars that makes it difficult and makes you feel inside of you that experience of culture shock. So when this student brought up the example of moving from a backward rural community to the metropolis of New York City, of course it was particularly shocking to him or difficult to him was that it was so much greater amount of, the difference was so great in technological things. But the question is, there's all sorts of other parts of that society where he came from which not necessarily should be considered backward, because they are actually all dealing with the same types of universals, but with different norms. Well, I'll give you, for instance, and I don't know the answer because I wasn't in his particular position, but in smaller rural communities where, and this is the way human beings mostly lived for thousands of years until the advent of the Industrial Revolution, people did not actually get to see a lot of people during the course of their lives. If you're living in a community of 60, 100, 250 people, and it takes you 2 hours to get to the next community, so you might have 2 or 3 or 4 communities of 300, 400 people that are available for you to meet during the course of your life, right? So you're not meeting more than 800 people in the course of your life. You probably are going to know most of them and certainly know most of the families, etc. That's going to affect the way you deal with people. For instance, in that sort of situation where you get up in the morning, of course you have your family, but you also have the other people in the community or in the village or in the town. If you see somebody, are you going to say hello to them? You're going to say good morning. You're going to say how are you? Is it going to mean something? Well, probably yes. What happens when you get up in the morning and if you're living with your family today in an urban situation, when you go down into the street, now you're going to see a lot more people, hundreds of people, more people than somebody in that, you might see in one day, more people during the course of that day than a person in that other community is seeing in the course of his life. Well, if they were, again, comparative to 200 years ago, but even course of life is as a person to person, because they might have television nowadays, they might be aware of other things, but nonetheless, actually face to face, person to person, it might be actually even more. So you don't say hello. You get much more distant from people. People become, well, there's a lot of them, so it's supply and demand. There's a lot more supply, and so the value comes less. In other words, seeing somebody's face is not something unique and valuable, right? So it's you don't need to interact with somebody else in order to foster human connection. If in a small community, so the question that becomes, in a small community, you don't actually foster the human connection, you might be breaking something big. So in other words, there must have been something in their human connectionness which was significantly different, because it was necessary for everybody to work with each other. And then what happens when you come to a metropolitan area? That becomes different. How do you connect with people? Well, you connect people because you have a particular, if it's a work or school situation, you might be closer. Or other social situations, you might have to go out to a club to meet people. In other words, it becomes that could be a culture shock. I come to the city. I don't know anybody. How am I supposed to meet somebody? I just say hello. I say hello. How are you doing? He says fine, and walks away. What sort of thing is that? Actually, this has been brought down in one particular article I saw, Sociology, about a Chinese student who came to America, and she was socialized that you don't speak and talk right away, and if you say, you don't speak to strangers at all. And if you do, it means you really, really want to have a conversation. She goes to the school, she goes to college, and she's in the building where she's going to have lecture. And students come up and she says, "Hi, how are you?" And she says, Well, thank you. I'm really kind of lost. I'm feeling that. And they walk away. Well, what sort of thing is that? How could you do such a thing? She's thinking to herself. Well, she got to use to get that culture shock, the different way of dealing with connections to people. So it's also not known only the technological side. In order to understand, you have to look also at the social side or the food side. I mean, if you don't have a lot of electricity, are you going to have restaurants? Are you going to have buy milk and put it in the freezer, or buy meat and save it in the freezer for the next 3 days? No, you have to have, or you might not be able to buy meat at all if there's not. You're only eating the stuff which is available. In certain communities where they are very rural, and they don't, if you're going to slaughter a cow, and you don't have large refrigeration facilities, well, what are you going to do? You have to get together and use it differently. So the way of eating would be different, and you might be using much more. If it's a poor community, you might be eating much more of the cow. I mean, you might. Why wouldn't you eat the brains and the udders and the liver? Well, liver we eat anyway, but all those different parts. They're certainly nutritious, and if you wouldn't want to just throw it away necessarily, so that might be different. It's a different way of dealing with the cultural particulars, and that's where the cultural shock actually comes in. It would be the same thing, though, even in the United States. People, I know that if I visit my relatives in Florida, I walk down the street, everybody says hello and good morning. I work in New York City. Walk down 8th Avenue, try saying hello to everybody. You probably won't be very happy about it. And that's what I want to talk about, and that's what I want people to think about. When you're talking about culture shock, think about the different parts of how each idea that goes on within each cultural universal, how it is dealt with from one community to the other. The norms are different, and how that affects a person when they move from one culture to the other. That's when you get the culture shock. When to dealing with those things which has to do with food, has to do with shelter, right? Are you locking the doors at night? Why are you not knocking the doors at night? Etc. Things like that. When it has to do with interactions, social interactions, making friends, enjoying music, etc., 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 and how these are dealt with differently, and how you have to learn this when you move from one culture to the other.